Space Marine Chapter Foundings. The old general looked out at his staff and sneered. It had been a complete success, a total victory. The enemy had been driven before them, then utterly annihilated. The Xenos threat was ended, and his men cheered and drank themselves into stupefaction. But all he could concentrate on was the cost. He knew there should be joy, must be celebration. It was required to keep the spirits of the men high, and they had earned it. But he could not enjoy a single moment, not one, for he would never see his friend again, because they had fallen, all of them. Their drop pod strikes, their fleet engagements, they had bought the time he needed to muster the forces of the Guard, the Astra Militarum under his command, had smashed the enemy before he even set sail toward them. So that which came on at his ships of the line, the forces on the planets they had infested, they were mere dregs. The heart of the war had been ripped from it before his men even assembled, let alone took the field against them. But in doing so, they had been wiped out. He rose, waving away his attendants with a curt nod and an explanation of fatigue. He left the bawdy ballroom. He went to remember and to mourn. General Masterna usually strode everywhere. His shoulders back, his head high, the air of command that surrounded him, not generated by the stars or medals or rank insignia, but by his countenance, his very being. But not tonight. As he left the light and laughter and loud music of a celebration of victory, a pageant to life, his pose shifted. The shoulders slumped, the head dropped, and his eyes, ever forward, ever on his course, now surveyed the long corridor to his destination, the most secluded spot on the entire station, his most favoured place in the galaxy. For it was quiet, an island of calm and tranquility, in an existence of constant buffeting crowds and questioning faces, orders, dispatches, meetings, and direction. He was a conductor of the orchestra that was the Imperium's war machine, a leader amongst a race forever under assault, perpetually one set of mistakes away from extinction, no matter how powerful humanity may seem. Few knew how their entire civilization balanced precariously on the very nice edge. He did. But not because he was a general, had been for a long year even then. Because so many of the generals and leaders of the forces of mankind were insular, siloed, bunkering in their own microcosmic empires. They did not see the bigger picture, because the canvas was too huge, too expansive. But General Mastana had come to see that one tiny segment of the tapestry could reveal more than the dizzying panoramic visage of the whole. All because of his unlikely friend, the one he came to mourn so bitterly. His slow steps rang out. He had his boots cuffed in metal at their sole and at their tip, just for this effect. He had done so because he was so tired of the scurrying and panic movement people performed when he appeared unexpectedly. So the shoes had metal tip and sole, so he announced his arrival way before its advent. But now, the slow clip of his pace echoing along the corridor did nothing but underline the emptiness. The reason he had loved this spot had become the reason he now hated it, because it would now be empty He knew this, but it hurt. He turned the last corner, and just for 1 second, for one fleeting moment, he closed his eyes as he did so he could pretend, so he could avoid the moment for just 1 second longer. But he could not. He cursed his stupidity, his weakness, as he slowly raised his eyes, and there it was. The small viewport at the end of his journey, but nothing else. He took the paces required to get to the aperture into the void, then just stood there, looking out at the beauty of the nebula. Its colors and lights flickering, it was hypnotic in its sublime perfection. The light shone, and he could feel them twinkling off the light now welling up in his eyes. He was alone, for his friend was not there, and never would be again. He cast his mind back to the first time, how he had been so desperately looking for a spot of sanctuary. His first day on the station, his first command. And yet it had been too much. He had to take an hour to himself before he went to his palatial apartments, the largest on this station. So he had walked and walked, until finally the crowds became occasional passers-by, then on, until none passed him at all. He walked past, then took 2 paces back, and into this one quiet area. The lights had dazzled him so that he missed out on the only other thing there. He lurched mesmerized, and he was able to place his hand on the viewport, infinity and beauty in his fingers, as he looked out on the nebula. His reverie was interrupted when he took fright and leapt a bunny hop back in shock. Someone had been standing there too, a Goliath in warplate, a statue of perfection. And he looked at the figure that stood beside him so tranquilly. He was a gargantuan, easily over 8 foot in his mammoth armor, yet his face, his visage, it was calm, his features so pure, his gaze so intent and yet so open. The being was an Astartes, a space marine. From his near-perfect makeup, his long blonde hair, he could be nothing but a son of the angel. Mastana's gaze elicited movement, and it was as if that statue suddenly came to life. He moved slowly, carefully, calmly, turning his head to look down to Mastina. Looking back, General Mastina knew that the angel had moved this way to prevent him from running. For he had seen them in combat, and their merest gesture could terrify and shatter the mind for a moment, could form a rout. For something so large, so powerful, so strong, to move with such alacrity, such precision, it bent the normal laws of reality that the human mind could accept without recoiling. This was a kindness unto itself. As their eyes met, the deep blue of the Astartes was rich and almost kind, as pristine an expression as faced a lie, for within those eyes the pain and struggle of hundreds of years were dancing. Yet also contained within was the passion of a father defending his child, all framed by the ivory perfection of a noble face. He just nodded down at Mastina, before returning to his basking in the beauty of the galaxy. The general did the same, and they both enjoyed the silence together. Not one word was said. Finally, Mastina had turned and saluted the marine, his legs so tired from the transit, and then being on them without break for 24 hours in this, his first day. He did not want to break the moment, but could not elongate it any longer. He had to rest before the havoc of the day to come. To his surprise, the marine just nodded his head and half smiled, seemingly unable to break his concentration on the viewport. And so the pattern was set, a pattern that lasted over 100 years. For his station was the main stopping off point in the sector, From here, General Mastina organized the Astra Militarum to meet the threats. And it was here that the blood spears had to dock as they went from one end of the sector to the other, always moving, always fighting. And whenever the Astartes fleet docked for any reason, Mastina would look to his control panels to see if anyone was there, in that place, that sacred spot. And he always was, standing alone, a moment of respite in a world of war and death and pain. Mastina would conclude the business of the day and always, always take the time to go to simply stand with the Marine. The Blood Spears chapter was guarding this region of space, so they passed the central stack very often. It took a decade of this, until finally it began. Words. Beautiful, isn't it? The perfect angel said, with such passion it shocked Mastina. That was all. And when Mastina never bothered the Marine, never questioned, never said a word, it slowly developed. After a decade more of limited lines, small statements, Mastina answered back, but only briefly at first. While they both basked in the glory of light and colour, of a moment of rest in a world of war, a kinship, a bond was formed. And by the end of it, after more than 8 decades, and a painful rejuve for Mastina, it was a ritual neither would miss. For the angel now spoke to Mastina, telling him of the actions he had fought, where he was going, what they had done. And Mastina would not console, would not praise or simper. He merely listened, calmly, with compassion, but without pity. The list was never ending, no respite ever for his friend. He even brooked this once, the only time he ever did. We move on to Phi Cantor Alpha to meet elements of the Navy, the 285th Flotilla. We will be clearing out the Corsairs base your men so ably pinpointed. Then on to Boris 12 to confront the Myrna. Xenos incursions from the nebula are ramping up, old friend. Then, if the Emperor guides our bolters and our warp routes, we will be returning to head to Apollon Secundus for the campaign against the War. A hard decade, this one. With the rift, things are worse, said Mastina. I must ask, in all of the time I have known you, we have never discussed your respite, your core. How can even you go from war to war without breaking, without rest? What do you do to stay sane? The angel looked at him, almost in shock, and he slowly swept out his hand at the vista they both viewed. I have this. That was all he said. These few hours snatched in months of endless engagements, seconds only really. Mastina did not know. How could he? He felt ashamed that he had interrupted the angel's only quiet moments, and for 2 visits he let him be. Until on the 3rd visit, a communication came to the deck. The first and only time he ever sent a message. It said simply, "Your presence is missed." And so Mastina returned to his vigils with him. He felt so honored. He took notes, many records, and made them a document, a testimony. He had always written them up in rough and put in the details of locations and battles when they are long past, when there was no strategic import anymore. And the annals, as Mastina called them, grew. Until that final day. The largest war ever seen in this region had erupted out of nowhere. Rocks slammed into worlds across the sector, and the worst of it was that they made a path straight for the core station. But before that, the pathway took them on a straight line to the chapter planet of the Blood Spears. The regiments were bogged down in long engagements, or on furlough. Standing preparedness had been ground down under the constant conflicts since the warp tear across the galaxy. And the Blood Spears were few, less than half of a chapter's strength. So many times had command advised that the chapter be permitted to reprovision and to be given a short reprieve to recruit. But they had always refused. Always. The battle barge docked, its small fleet of strike cruisers and supports. All that remained of the chapter's strength that was not already at their home world, preparing for the battle to come. And the angel was there, standing, but he seemed tense when Mestina arrived. By just the tiniest shuffles, the minutest sway, he gave away his disquiet. And then he spoke again, but faster than usual, with good pace, clear, but with a tinge of desperation. He had much to tell. And so they stood, and he told Mestina. He told him his name. He told him how he had become an angel, how he had trained, how he had learnt, how he had developed. He told Mestina of all the things he did not know. Nothing a mortal man should not know, of course. But as much as he could tell him, he did. And Mestina knew when he finished. He knew he had told him all of these things because... Mestina saluted him as always, but his finest, sharpest salute. And for the first time ever, the angel turned to him fully, and slowly gave the sign of the Aquila, and bowed. Mestina left him for the first time ever. Instead of going to his apartments, he went back to the command. He worked and worked until his eyes swam, his vision blurred. It was days before he was forced to rest. He took 6 hours sleep, then returned. He would push his men, would send messages and orders, would smooth every hold-up, remove any of the tiny glitches that slowed a muster by calling even subalterns personally. There would be no delays. He sent out commissars with orders to execute any who caused any form of hold-up. He would get the men ready. For the Blood Spears were facing the full fury of the war, and they could not do it alone. Not at only 40% of their strength. If anyone could do it, if anyone could hold out long enough, it would be them. So Mestina worked harder than he had since he was 20. He was tireless. For once, just this once, he wanted to return the favor. For it to be the forces of his Astra Militarum who came in and saved the day. Not for ego or honor, but because they owed the Blood Spears. So much did they owe them. The Navy finally mustered, his men finally aboard. He took command himself and led them to the path of the war. But they were too late. Damn them. They were not in time. The orcs they met on their way were pitiful mobs of rabble. Their vessels were battered and smashed and far, far fewer than reports made believe. And so the Navy swept them before them. But then they found out why. He had known, of course, but most had not. They arrived at the chapter planet of the Blood Spears. When they translated into real space, the system was cluttered with debris. Millions of tons of scrap blasted apart and floating like minefields in their path. So much carnage had the Blood Spears' own ships meted out to the orcs. The scans showed them all they needed to know. They sent out Mechanicus and Militarum forces. They checked over the still burning wreck of that place, that fortress. The orcs had destroyed everything. They had killed near all of the Marines, beaten them down, smashed their bodies to pulp when they fell. Only one pair of survivors were said to be interned into dreadnoughts. So the Blood Spears were gone. The orcs had even taken their gene seed and used it for a bonfire, throwing it at walls to see if it would stick, fed it to their horrifying little ball monsters. The Blood Spears were gone for all time. And so, Mestina hunted down and exterminated the last remains of the Xenos. But it would never bring them back. It was revenge only. And when he returned to his post, his headquarters amongst the stars, he wrote his report. He knew nobody would ever take it seriously. It would avail him naught. But he had to write it. He had to send it. He had to make his case for a founding. A mere general in an outlying border. He knew he was wasting his time. But it was all he had to spare now. Time. For he never went back to that viewport again. The time he would have spent there, he spent on the annals, to make them perfect, so he could pass them on. Story continued at the conclusion. Welcome, gentle listener. I'm Voldemort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the important forces, factions, and elements of the Warhammer 40k universe, the grim darkness of the far future, where there is no time for peace, there is only time for war. And today, we shall be discussing how a chapter of Space Marines is actually formed, both historically and at the very moment. For so much has changed in the setting with the awakening of the Avenging Sun, the Primarch reboot Guilliman. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. One golden question that many will ask is, why does the Imperium have to create new chapters at all? For surely, the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, are the most powerful of all of the armies in the setting. How could any Xenos, monster, mutant, or demon truly bring them low? And if there are 1,000 chapters of Marines, then why would the Imperium even need to make more of these self-contained armies as super soldiers? Well, I hope my little tale at the beginning shows how this can be required. For the Space Marines are indeed some of the mightiest warriors humanity has ever created, only ever outshone by the incredibly rare action from the Custodian Guard, the Custodes, the very bodyguards of the Master of Mankind, the Emperor, only they are mightier. Even so, the battles that they fight, the enemies they oppose, the odds they surmount on a daily basis, the Astartes are not invulnerable and not infallible, and they do indeed die. What many forget when they see the Space Marines, what they are and what they do, is the horrific lives they live. They see the armor making each more a walking tank or a superheroic Iron Man, the weapons that can melt, explode, or punch directly through even gods and monsters. Their superior tactics, written by geniuses that not only encompass all of humanity's collective wisdom on the subject, but with battlefield experience from dominating the better part of the galaxy. Their transports that are nigh and indestructible, and with the firepower to level mountains. But it is not necessarily the power of their adversaries and enemies that should be most weighed, as terrifying and mind-boggling as that can be, but their frequency. For the Space Marines never tire, never slack, never rest. When one battle concludes, one campaign is won, they simply move on to the next one immediately. The Imperium stands on the precipice, not despite its size, but because of it. It does not cover a millionth of the amount of stars in our actual galaxy, but they are clustered around the warp routes that are still in place, that are stable, meaning that all other races or powers are after this prime real estate as well. Thus they are under constant attack, constant assault. Tyranids, Orcs, Necrons, Tau, Chaos, Traitors and Mutants, Eldar, Drukhari, and a plethora of Xenos races that have not yet been thrown into the spotlight. Vampires, ghouls, Psych-Nuin, etc., etc. The list goes on and on. The grim darkness of the future is called thus because the human race does indeed dwell in a protracted horror setting where all of the universe is against us. So much so that even the doughty, stoic Marines can be ground down. Though they turn back armies and foes innumerable, each action takes its toll in men and resources, and they cannot always replenish their numbers while fighting these battles. And then some foes, are too much for even these paragons of martial skill and power. Greater demons, shards of Catan star gods, farseers who hail the battlefield with lightning, tower suits that can shoot them from the horizon, orcs who can grow to the size of dreadnoughts. The list goes on. In one event, an entire chapter can be wiped from existence, for there are only 1,000 of them. And against such foes, as well as the general vicissitudes and vagaries of warp or void transit, mishaps, misdirections, and betrayals, the Marines are not as plentiful as one might think. So yes, they die. And yes, sometimes the Imperium of mankind does sluggishly move to rectify the issue. So new foundings are required, but it cannot be understated how much of a tax on the entire Imperium of man this endeavor requires. It is a task of Herculean proportions. Why is a founding called, and by whom? We shall go through the foundings in order later. Well, the important ones. But let us discuss how they come about before we explore what is involved. The founding of new Space Marine chapters is a thing of moment. It can only come from the highest body of the entire Imperium, the High Lords of Terra. Nor can it be on a whim. It is never calculated as one would a balance sheet. So they would never say, we lost X amount of chapters and require Y amount to replenish the numbers, for the Imperium simply does not have that level of automatic efficiency in it anymore. Clogged with administration, bureaucracy, and stifling incompetence, the Imperium lurches more than moves forward. Thus logical analysis is rarely a given. So how are the High Lords convinced to form a new founding? This can be for many reasons. There is a front that requires to be defending. The most obvious would be the Astartes Praeses. These are the chapters of Space Marines that were charged with the defense of the borders of real space around the Eye of Terror, tasked to prevent the chaos-tainted traitor legions from breaking out and attacking the Imperium as whole. Should a new threat appear, then the Strategic Prognostications Department may be aware of it before it truly materializes, by using the Emperor's Tarot, reports from rogue traders and border forces, seeing into the future with the powers of the warp itself by sanctioned psychers. Sometimes, the Imperium actually gets the jump on a situation, and when they are aware of an oncoming war, then sometimes they can move fast enough to enact a new founding to meet this threat. Another reason for a founding is to form the spine of a crusade, usually to regain lost realms, or to push out to counter expansionism from other races or forces. The Imperium does not sit on its thumbs and simply wait for the end. All throughout its history, the Imperium of mankind has struck back, has tried to push out, has never just closed the gates and tried to fully instill the Bastille of the Imperium that Rogel Dawn so wanted. They have always tried to expand. And it is through the use of crusades, with newly formed chapters of Space Marines at their center, that this has been done. But alas, as with everything in the grim darkness of the future, the reality would make a sane man weep. For as the High Lords are merely men or women, humans who see reality from their own perspective, with their own egos involved, it is almost a miracle of biblical proportions for a founding to occur and for them all to agree on it. It may boggle the mind, but some of the High Lords will not wish Marines to be created at all. A bad encounter with a chapter master, a slight, a massacre of men by these godlike beings, by traitor or even just harsh punishment from a loyalist chapter. All can cause resentment in the individual, and the council is definitely made up of individuals. Each Marine in a region makes an Astra Militarum general thankful, but also detracts from their importance by simple dint of not being the only military force protecting the region. The Navy can see each battle barge as either a welcome sight or a potential horror that could turn on them and maul a small fleet. With each of the figures and branches of the High Lords of Terror, there are a million secret agendas as they play the Game of Thrones with each other. Some have even moved against Reboot Gilliman, despite him being the last son of the Emperor, and perhaps the only thing that can save them all. Even so, Elements wish him deleted due to his infraction on what they consider their own power. As they say, anything done by committee is done slowly. Hence it is that a founding is not just a mammoth task materially, but politically. The will must be there and in accord in nearly every wing of the Imperium, for it is the High Lords entire that are the only ones who can enact the writ of succession and begin the slow process of the creation of chapters of Space Marines. So it is a rare thing indeed. But what happens next? Well, the High Lords finally agree, and then a writ of succession, or multiple writs of succession, are issued, and the process begins. Now some may think that this would be an easy and swift task, but they could not be further from the truth, for it is simply a matter of the scale of the undertaking that they do not factor. The Mechanicus of Mars are instructed to take the gene seed from their stocks and begin the process. They use human subjects to then begin to grow the zygotes required for the gene seed to create 1,000 warriors. And this can take decades to grow and culture safely for implantation into the new Marines. Decades. Each chapter must have a home, a base of operations. Now many chapters are formed around crusading forces. This should sound simple, as their home will be the battle barges and ships which they use to ply the void. But this then means that an entire fleet must be made for them, and each crusading chapter usually has an oversized battle barge at its center, as its flag, so almost a bespoke vehicle. A bespoke ship is a very expensive endeavor. An entire fleet of ships, though, for just one chapter. If the chapter is to be of the other order, to have a home world, then that world must be found. It must either have existing or be able to support a human populace from which the Marines can be taken as aspirants. But it must be a world where life is harsh, conditions are the most severe that make existence there a constant struggle. One that the Marines could quash easily if they just wish to walk from their monasteries with all of their armor and war gear, but one they permit, even endorse, so it can breed the warriors of the future. For it is not mere discipline and training that make a Space Marine. If that was so, then it would be far more practical to make them. No. There is a very special something about the Marine, for at one end they are as far from human as can be imagined. They are creatures without fear, without pity or remorse, things that are not only made for war, but also look forward to it. Yet on the other hand, the other end of the spectrum, the Marines are actually possibly the most human beings in the universe. Oh, you may say. How do you figure that out? Well, simply, because they fight all day, every day, without remit or respite. They kill and crush and burn all throughout their existence. Their every waking hour and thought is directed to war. We all know this. Aye. But have you ever considered that these beings are the most human simply because of the one fact? The pure do not bend. They do not break, and despite all of the horrors that they endure and are forced to perform, they remain human. Some fall to the wayside, and this is shown as a reason for them not to be trusted, but the miracle itself is that they do not all do so within a century of their creation. PTSD, horror unrelenting, the never-ending war would break any of us, no matter how tough we may believe we are. It would change us, twist us, make us into horrors. But the Space Marines walk through hell, yet let no part of it touch them. They stay true to their calling. And that is why the horrors of their culture, the pain that could so easily be eradicated by the Marines themselves, is permitted to continue to forge these men into the beings they must be to endure what is to come. When one looks at it through this lens, it is hard to believe that any of the Marines stay pure at all, stay even slightly human in the midst of all of this. Possibly the most wondrous thing in the entire setting, if I am honest. So the finding of a planet with the right stuff is not easy. Finding a world and then gaining another culture, or even creating one on a world with forced immigration, can be a very real challenge. and takes time. Now to the erection itself. Snigger if you must. Each fortress monastery must be unique, as otherwise to siege and defeat one would teach any enemy how to defeat all. So each one must be a thing of power and one of a kind. Hence it is that entire panels will be constructed to choose the military and architectural savants who will sit on the actual planning board. Each one has to be a castle, a bastion of defense that punishes any who assault it, with a dizzying myriad of traps, murder holes, walls, turrets and parapets. This can take some time unto itself, let alone the building of this huge edifice. Then on to the resources. As stated, Marines have their own ships, so crusading chapter or no, at least 2 battle barges and their support ships will be needed. Now the Navy will not always be grateful that their own quotas are not met while this is all going on. And the lines of manufacturing that must be constructed on Forge Worlds must be factored as well. For power armor is not a thing that is made easily, let alone the lines required for the creation of Terminator armor that the new chapter's first company may or may not gain. And these are not cases of one and done. These are lines of manufacturing that will be required to roll on forever, throwing out bolters and armor and vehicles and equipment until either the chapter or the Forge World are destroyed. Yes, much is made inside the forges of the chapter itself, but not all. So it is not just the mammoth task of creating 1,000 suits of power armor, bolters, grenades, tanks, transports and drop pods and the like, and it is the ongoing commitment to replenishment that substantially reduces the Forge World's ability to denote productivity to other areas, like super heavy battle tanks for the Guard or battleships for the Navy. So I hope I've related the scale, depth and sheer effort that is required to create a founding. Now let us discuss some of the most important foundings that have occurred up to this point. This will be a very brief overview of them. As with some of the foundings, their details are such that I feel we can revisit the topic in the future and expound on the most interesting ones. But let us at least have an overview for today. The first founding. At the dawn of the Imperium, when the Emperor of Mankind arose and created his Custodian Guard and then his Thunder Warriors, then finally, distilling the process and its results, he generated the first founding. The Legiones Astartes, the Space Marine legions, were formed. 20 were created, an army for every specialist role or style of warfare, yet all capable of taking a standard field of combat and smashing near any foe that existed in the galaxy. These are the Legiones Astartes, the huge armies of Space Marines that could number over 100,000 men as they went out into the galaxy and grew as they went. For with these 20 legions, the Emperor began his great crusade to find, free and unify the many disparate worlds and peoples of humanity. It is from these 20 bloodlines that all subsequent Space Marines have come, and every single Space Marine in the 41st millennium traces their existence to these lines, whether they know which or not. With one obvious exception, of course, the Grey Knights. The second founding. After the Horus Heresy, while half of the remaining Primarchs and their legions fell to chaos, there was the event called the Scouring. 2 full legions were eradicated, and the history is removed by order of the Emperor himself, even before the events of the Heresy. So only 9 legions remained loyal, and chased what was left of their traitor 9 brother legions into the Eye of Terror. When all was done, the legions were smashed. From numbering over hundreds of thousands of Astartes, many were reduced to 3 digits in numbers only. The war over, the Primarch Reboot Guilliman wrote a new structure, a new way of war, an organization of the forces of the entire Imperium, to take the power from the hands of a few and distribute it to the many. Navy could not be ordered by army. Astartes could not directly order either unless ceded control by the respective admirals and generals. Yet the document he penned, called the Codex Astartes, changed everything for the Space Marines. The legions were disbanded, and their men broken into micro self-sufficient armies of 1,000 Marines only. The chapters. Thus it was that the legions that had more than 1,000 men remaining were broken down, and each 1,000 Marines was grouped into a chapter. Thus it was hoped that if one man went mad, he would not have the power of an entire legion of Marines behind him anymore. For each chapter had its own autonomy, its own chapter master, region, practices, and beliefs. Thus would any demagogue have to gain agreement and support from literally hundreds of people if they were intent on a rebellion, a much harder prospect to achieve. After the heresy, the Marines were as feared as they were admired. The people of the Imperium had to be shown that the Astartes would never ever again turn on them en masse. Hence the creation of successor chapters done in the second founding. For if a legion broke itself down, then, for example, all Iron Warriors were still of that lineage, still may admire and attempt to emulate their Primarch, their genetic sire, but only 1,000 Astartes, one chapter, would retain the name of Iron Warriors. The other chapters would choose individual names. The third founding, supposedly performed at the request of the Primarch Rogul Dawn of the Imperial Fists. In this event, over 100 writs of succession were drawn up, and chapters were formed. The fourth founding. The Imperium had been brought to its knees by the greatest war of orcs that had been seen since the Great Crusade in Alinor. Attack ships as large as moons had appeared across the breadth of the Imperium and disgorged millions of orcs across worlds uncounted. It nearly knocked out the Imperium in the one blow. But that story is for another time. The fourth founding was performed on the diktat of the Lord Commander of the Imperium, Maximus Dane. So desperate had the event been that all power had been concentrated in his hands for a short period. Things were that bad. And it was he who created hundreds of chapters of Space Marines. The 13th founding. The Dark Founding. An enigma in that there seemed to be so much that was not recorded about this founding. In a regime that is known for its choking administrative rigor, it was an anomaly that has given rise to many a speculation. But we shall definitely go into this one at another point. The 21st founding. The Cursed Founding. Aptly named, for the chapters from this founding have had nothing but a cursed existence. Some are unfathomably misfortunate, like the Lamentus chapter, or have developed mutations that could well endanger their existence if the Inquisition were to cast too prying an eye over them, the Black Dragons being in this camp. Now, obviously, there have been many a founding between these numbers. But this does bring us up to one interesting sidebar point. Many will always say that they have looked at the numbers of the recorded legions, their foundings, how it has happened and when. They quite rightly as well, and almost universally come up to the conclusion there are simply not enough chapters for the numbers that are thrown around. The 1,000 chapters of the Space Marines. Yet I look at this very simply. There is and never was a need for certainty. But why? Simply put, your choice to make up your own homebrew chapter is not only why there were 2 legions eradicated from the lore, perpetually making a mystery that you can fill yourself, but the foundings are just the highlights to me. They list the chapters the GW want to make into colour schemes, may write tales about, but there is always a huge swathe of unnamed and unknown chapters, so we can make our own. It means that each and every one of 100 different fans can make their own chapter, and no two will be the same. They can all attend the same event, match or contest, and every single one of them be not only legitimate, but actually breathe even more life into the strange and seductive setting. Sidebar over. The Ultima Founding. The 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon the Spoiler had broken Cadia, and by doing so it smashed the linked fortifications of Blackstone pylons, what is also called Noctilith, and the warp tore a rip across the entire galaxy, the Cicatrix Maledictum. In the years that followed, the forces of hell were led by the twisted traitor legions into real space from this rent. The very galaxy darkened for a time, and communication was impossible, while the Imperium was assailed from all quarters. Xenos, rebels, brigands, and cults all took their turn at the trough, and the days of the Imperium seemed done. Yet out of this darkness, a light arose. For the avenging sun, Raoult Guilliman of the Ultramarines, had awoken. He had returned to lead the human race out of darkness. It also transpired that he had set in motion a set of events that would end with Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Qual spending all of the centuries between his direction and the awakening of the Primarch on a new form of Space Marine. Thus, when Raoult finally made it to Terra, the center of the power of the Imperium, he was met by the Mechanicus savant, and his labors were revealed. The Primaris Marines. And Belisarius Qual had collected men from the outset of his task all the way to this time. He had made Raoult an army of Marines of all of the lineages. Thus did Raoult embark on his Indomitus campaign. So like the Great Crusade, but in miniature, it went out into the stars and reclaimed world after world. And when the Crusade met embattled and often sieged chapters of Marines, he left them not only the men to bring them up to full chapter strength, but also the technology to create their own Primaris Space Marines. And out of the thousands of these new Marines that Raoult led, he would regularly not only reinforce existing chapters, but would seed, would found entire new chapters by simply taking 1,000 of his Primaris and giving them the resources and the remit to take the banner of defending a region or countering a known threat. And so the Indomitus Founding gave birth to scores of new chapters. The Space Marines were back, and better than ever. A new form of warrior for a new age of unrelenting war. The Imperium was, for the time being at least, saved. I hope you can now see the scale of endeavour that is required for the creation of these mighty champions of humanity. The exertion of an entire race to one end, one goal. For of all of its horrors, all its grim darkness, it is the founding of this law that actually gives me most hope for my people, so disconnected by 38,000 years. For while the Space Marines stand on the walls of the Imperium, guard us from the darkness of the void and all that dwell within, then surely there is at least a chance, a slither of one, perhaps, but a chance. So I invite you to take out your Marines, and when time permits, to troop them, to arrange them in their units, ranks and files, to proudly display them. Don't do it for you and your endless enjoyment of the spectacle alone. Do it for them. For in a universe of war, let their banners fly high, for they most certainly have earned the right. For these are no mere toys, no mere objects. What you have on your shelves in your cave, they are symbols, and they are the thin line that protects our future selves from all of the horrors of a galaxy that slavers to consume us all. So give them some damn respect. Troop them. For I guarantee that if you do it right, it will be one day you will not forget. I have been Baltimore, your faithful servant. I hope you've enjoyed this brief introduction to Space Marine Foundings. If so, then please consider liking and subscribing. If you do, then hit the notifications button, as I would not want you to miss out. If you see the worth in what we are doing, then do also consider joining our Patreon, or giving the video a share if that is beyond your present scope. It would be a great boon. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo. And now, back to the end of the story. Times had been hard, and the Reaper now wished his toll. It had been many decades now. We had been cut off from the outside and communication was almost pointless. We never gained a response we could trust. Astropathic choirs had been almost pointless and were a massive risk to use. I had tried, had done my duty. Another rejuve, then another. I was not meant to live this long, I think. Thought General Mestina. And it was the end. After such a long time. The endless attacks. Corsairs, greenskins, the silvered legions of the dead, the predations of a myriad of small pocket Xenos powers that had grown up in our weakness. And we were on the last throw of the dice. As the latest war came ploughing out of the void towards my station, I knew it was over. But we would fight anyway. With near 40% of our previous realm chewed away, we lost resources and manpower. The last assault had been the worst for decades. For without that one chapter of Space Marines, that one force of a mere 1,000 super soldiers, we were lost. They say the Guard fights the wars, the Marines win the battles. But without the Marines to win some of those hardest of all battles, we, the Militarum, had lost. Slowly at first. Then the dam had broken. We faced certain destruction at the hands of these scum. That's what I thought. Yet when they were closing, eating up the thousands of miles between us, the impossible happened. A miracle. For out of the warp, a fleet translated. Battle barges, strike cruisers, escorts, and Astartes force. Sent to throne. They had come. And I could not do anything but stare slack-jawed at the screen as the markings came into my vision. It was not possible. They were gone. Then one simple message was beamed from the capital battle barge of 3. It read simply, "To General Maskiner, you fought like a tiger over the years, kept the fires burning. But it's time to order your forces to withdraw and stand down. We have this. I'm sorry it took so long, old friend." And the message read, "From the Blood Spear's chapter master." Mascano looked on as the ships of the Astartes force fell into an oh-so-familiar attack pattern. Their vessels were new, their markings freshly painted, but familiar. And the Orc force was smashed within an inch of their finishing line, for if they had taken this station, the entire sector would have fallen. Yet the fury of the Astartes was unstoppable, and soon all that remained of the invasion force was a scrap field, one he had not seen since that day he translated over a certain fortress monastery world, all those years ago. At the conclusion of the battle, Mastina slumped into his chair for a moment, while his exhausted bridge staff whooped and cheered at their survival, their deliverance. He wiped his face of the sweat there, and then rose. He barked out orders for the next 8 hours, as the Astartes fleet broke up and scouted the entire system for stragglers. The lead battle barge came into dock, and it was irrefutable. The sigils the same, the colours, the banners, all the same. When all was quiet, when all was done, Mastina went to the only place he could think of, just in case. And as he walked, his feet echoed on the hard deck and corridors again. He did so with purpose, and he was not disappointed. For as he turned that corner toward the viewport, there a Marine stood. He had a long cape just off the ground, gold and red in its trim, helm in the crook of his left arm, long blonde hair cascading down his back, like a mantle for his cape. But he stood in the spot. And so, General Mastina slowly paced up to his place and stood, viewing the nebula. And thus, the warrior next to him spoke. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Mastina slowly turned his head, but found he had to crane it up even more than he remembered. He had not been around Marines for so long. Had he forgotten their size? The angel broke the silence again. No, you are not mistaken. I am taller now." And he began his tale, always looking out at the nebula. "You see, I was found by the Mechanicum, my body broken, barely alive. They interned me in the dreadnought then, when the spears were disbanded. Nothing left to remain for. They placed me in another chapter. I had thought that the end. I fought and was awoken again, slept and awoken again. But in all of that time, something else was afoot. You see, someone had sent a message, a plea to the High Lords of Terra, a request for a founding. It never got there, but it was received by the Indomitus Crusade, something I will explain later. At first, it was ignored along with so many other transmissions, but one ensign read it. He took it to his data slate and read it for weeks, every line, every paragraph, and he gave it to others, and they gave it to others. And slowly by slowly it rose through the ranks. Until finally, a trillionth to one chance. A man that is not a man. A leader that is more a god. The son of the Emperor, Reboot Gilliman himself, read it. For all that was going on, it was so compelling, so honest, so true, that is what he told me, that he could not stop reading it. And he took action. He had men of the blood with him in his grey shields, but more than this, he asked one question that nobody else would. Are any of them left? Even one? And so it was that I was found. I was brought aboard his ship, and he spoke to me himself, offered me the choice, and I accepted. They took me from my dreadnought, performed a surgery on me that seemed unlikely to work. Only Mark Naeus Calgar had received this before and lived, but they made me whole again. They made me Primaris. And then he, Reboot Gilliman, made me the chapter master, and he gave me all of the men, ships and support I would need. So the blood spears are back. We are here now. Because of you. Because you wrote that annal of my words. Because you sent it out when anybody else would have put it on a wall for their own posterity. Because of you. Thank you, Mestina. You have no idea what it was like without you and the spears. We lost so much. The angel now stretched out his much larger arm and simply put his hand on the general's shoulder. Did not look at him, continued to look out at the stars, and simply said, Don't worry, Mestina. We are returned. We shall take it all back. And the blood spears will stand with you, your men, your women. We will win the battles you cannot fight. We will endure. We will fight together in the name of the Emperor until the stars themselves burn cold.